So I am here with Seth Scott from Perfect Hat Games, and they are the creators of Membrane for the Nintendo Switch. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Seth.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, what's your elevator pitch for your game?
Membrane is a creative action puzzle game where players get to build, bend, and break the world around them to interact with and solve all the different physics-based puzzles.
Awesome. What do you do on the dev team?
I guess kind of do everything, a little bit of everything. The team is composed of my wife Jess and myself, and the game started out as my thesis project in graduate school, and yeah, we kind of did it all ourselves and recorded the music, did the art, did the programming, level design, marketing. Everything was done in-house, I guess, so to speak.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, first off, you mentioned the art. I would say that is one of the first things that I noticed about Membrane. It's got an extremely unique art style. I would say that it reminded me of like 1990s MTV animation shows. I don't know if you were...
Yeah, Liquid Television.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Is that like the inspiration for that, or can you just talk a little bit about the inspiration for the art in Membrane, because it's really unique?
Sure, yeah. First of all, it's great that that's kind of the reference or the place that your mind went with it, because yeah, definitely, my wife and I are both in our mid-30s and kind of grew up as teenagers in the 90s. And so we're definitely, whether it's comes through in all of our art or only some of it, we're definitely super inspired by the kind of MTV-ish Liquid Television kind of stuff like you were talking about. That little more like rough 90s animation, which we both kind of grew up loving. So that's where part of it comes from. And I think some of the other stuff was a little bit more about the game design and kind of functionality of the game and having, this kind of simple color palette in a way to make things easier for the players to read and kind of scan as they're looking and exploring the levels. So yeah, that's kind of where the two kind of parts of it come together.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Where did your talk a little bit about your history as a gamer? Like what kind of games did you play? I mean, you said that this is your what started out as your thesis, so you probably haven't made much before this, unless it's just been like little personal projects. But what kind of games did you play when you were growing up that said, okay, I want to make my own games?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess the first kind of video game console I ever got was a Nintendo in the late 80s, an NES, and grew up, late 80s and throughout the 90s playing, Nintendo and Sega, all those consoles that were just the main kind of things you could find, both handheld and console, whether it was Game Boy or Game Gear. Definitely loved, Nintendo games, Super Mario World and Mario RPG, Donkey Kong Country, obviously kind of hit all those benchmarks of that kind of golden age 16-bit Nintendo era. But I also started kind of getting a little more into, I guess, more experimental or indie titles as I kind of started getting into college and stuff like that. And that's kind of where I got this first idea in my mind that like maybe I could make games, or there's this kind of other area of games that's not just this kind of stereotypical perfectly crafted platformer. There's kind of these other things that you can maybe kind of try and create, or experiences people are making that aren't necessarily the usual kind of video game type thing.
Gotcha. So, did you go to school for making games, or were you in school for, like, say, computer science, and did you kind of steered yourself toward games? What's your background?
Yeah, so I grew up with in a kind of, I guess, a my mom was a musician and my dad was an artist, and so I kind of grew up in this artistic family, and so I went to school, and I was kind of always had art in the forefront of what I was making and creating and stuff like that. And so I got an undergraduate degree in fine arts, and basically outside of the normal little jobs here and there, I worked worked with kids and as an educator for most of my life, whether it was my first job at 14, like as a junior counselor, all the way up to like running before and after school programs, and then ultimately becoming a grade school teacher for a handful of years after undergrad. That was kind of where I came to be, and I was never really had a computer science background. I never had that kind of programming element. It was more just I was in the creative kind of artistic side of things. Until I went back to graduate school just recently, these last couple years, after I was out of school for a handful of years. And that's where I kind of learned the computer science and programming side and was able to, learn how to program a game like Membrane.
So, I'm sure that there's a lot of people who are listening who are thinking to themselves, I would like to make a game myself.
Yeah.
When you were making Membrane, first off, how do I want to phrase this? I guess like what programming languages did you use to make this game that eventually ended up on a Nintendo console, which is
right.
Like that's one of the goalposts right there is, can you get your game on a Nintendo?
Right. Yeah. So the whole thing was written in C#. And the game was built in Unity, which is, a pretty widely used thing from indie devs all the way up to some bigger game companies as well are using it now. And that's what it was. Yeah, it's all C# and just used Unity to put it all together. And yeah.
Is Membrane on any other platforms, or is it just on Nintendo Switch for now?
Currently, it's just on the Switch. It was kind of a decision that Jess and I made since we're such a small team and kind of, doing all of it ourselves and working really hard to just get it out there and make it really, as good as we possibly can. So we wanted to make sure we focused on kind of one console and one launch at a time, since, as we kind of were going down this road of finishing the game and then, coming on board with Nintendo to make it run on the Switch and learning, how to work with their hardware and how to make it run and perform correctly. It was, we didn't want to spread ourselves too thin on trying to like make it run on multiple consoles. And so, yeah, it's just on Switch now, but we're looking for sure. It's probably going to come out like on computer or Steam, PC, Mac, spring or summertime. We'd love to bring it to other consoles if that becomes a possibility, but yeah.
So, all right, this is your freshman, your freshman game. You've never made a game before. How is it that somebody who's never been in a game made a game before and is not actually in the industry? Mm-hmm. How is it that you get matched up with Nintendo? Because for the most part, they're pretty closed off from what I've heard traditionally about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, this is definitely my first like console release game. This is the biggest game I've ever made. But one thing that Jess and I both really pride ourselves on and kind of is ultimately part of the reason that we, became best friends and became partners and all that stuff is we both have been very creative in lots of different outlets and spent a lot of our time, making a ton of stuff, whether it's art or music, painting, sculpture, media arts, things like that. And, we've just spent the better part of 10 or 15 years just making as much as we can and trying to be creative like every single day. And I was doing a lot of art and music stuff and teaching full time, which I love, and kind of stumbled upon this graduate program at NYU, and it is their kind of whole approach is this fine arts approach to game design instead of a computer science type maybe school or approach. And it seemed kind of like the perfect place for me because of my background and because you didn't have to necessarily have a programming background to just get in at all. And so, once I got into the school, I just basically spent 2 years working 24/7 on game design and programming and everything I could, and really, really worked my butt off, and ended up just making something that I felt really proud of and thought was a really good polished product, and decided to try and go all out and see if I could kind of fulfill a lifelong dream of having a game on a Nintendo system, and that's kind of how it started.
So did they have like an application that you could send in, or did somebody like at the school have like a contact, or did Nintendo say, hey, we've seen your work. You want to bring that to the Switch? How did that work?
So ultimately, I like I said, I have been a fan of games and into games and kind of tried to be as a part of the community as I could, just making stuff on my own and putting stuff out online or whatever. And I knew that, last spring, the Nintendo was releasing the Switch. And I know that through my own research and just through, like you said, hearing what you've heard from other people, that Nintendo has, in even the last decade-ish, like had a different relationship with indie developers. But the indie developer community and just acceptance in the world of gaming has changed so much in the last decade. And people are really starting to appreciate and see the kind of creative and original things that indie devs are doing, and realizing that sometimes they can be just as great and polished products as these bigger companies. And so I think Nintendo has been trying to jump on board with that and realizing that there is this market for indie developers. And so I really spent a lot of time and put together. I had this game that I was been working on for half a year, a little more, and I had a really solid build of it. I thought it was unique and creative, and really proud of it. And I worked really hard to put together a pitch and a presentation for my game and for the product and why I thought it would be good on the Switch. And I reached out to them, and at that time they were kind of looking for developers. Like I had seen some things online that were saying, like if you're interested in developing, you can kind of try and reach out or this or that. And it ended up being a long process where I had to kind of talk with people and go through this whole kind of thing. But they really liked the game and thought it was original and creative and looked cool and weird, and something that they felt they wanted to kind of get behind. And they allowed me to make it and put it out on their system, which I'm really thankful for, and ultimately really, really happy and proud of where it's come.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, I don't remember who said it, but at some point somebody said that a game is never finished. It is only abandoned. What is one thing that you wish that you had done differently, or one thing that you felt like you had to leave out just because of time constraints or something like that with Membrane?
Wow, that's a great question, and something that, yeah, for sure is, I don't know if I've heard that quote, but that's a really good one. Makes total sense and is very, very apt. Let's see. I guess that as the game was kind of coming into form, I had this different narrative for the game, and it was something that wasn't quite right in its initial kind of culmination within the game itself, and it was something that just wasn't fitting with the rest of the game, and it felt like it was taking away from the level to level kind of interaction. And we kind of scrapped it because we knew that if we wanted to make this narrative what we hoped it could be and knew it could be, if we spent time on it, it was just going to take too much time and resources. And it was something we didn't want, in a way to spend that time on, because we kind of had this internal timeline of when we wanted the game to release. And we sat down and worked a lot on kind of trying to come up with something else. And, Jess was the one that had the original idea for what is the kind of narrative arc of the game now. And it's something that in retrospect now, I'm actually like really happy with what it is, and I love what it is now, and in its kind of simplicity and its framing. But it's something that I do think about from time to time as like, oh, it'd be interesting to see where that could have went as the narrative. But ultimately, some things you have to kind of decide what features or what things you have to cut or keep. So yeah, that would be my guess.
All right. You mentioned the narrative, and I'm going to say right now, for anybody who's listening who hasn't touched the game and interacted with it past the tutorial, skip ahead for a couple minutes. But I just want to ask this question because hopefully they've skipped ahead by now. Like the moment it's very early in the game, but that moment where you first see like the outline of the body,
right?
And like when it you can see this in my preview on YouTube.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Yeah.
When I discovered that that's what the game was, where you're like an electrical signal going from the brain to the hand to swat this fly. Now I haven't finished the game yet because there's some puzzles that are stumping me, and I'm still working my way through it. But am I right about that? That's what's going on here. Yeah,
you're spot on. That's and actually, it's funny because there's you're spot on with the narrative, and there's terminology in the game, or like we don't necessarily name everything, name the character, name exactly what your little red bricks are called or anything like that. So like it's interesting to see different players, whether or not it's previews or reviews or let's plays of people and what they call different things. But I think you're the first person that called it an electrical signal, a brain signal, which is what the little yellow character's name is. We've been calling him SIG, S-I-G, which is short.
Brilliant.
Short for signal. And most people do, well, maybe it's 50-50 or a little more, that when they see that outline of the body, they're like, oh, this is what it is. You're like swatting the fly. This is like a very long abstract version of that split-second moment when you try and swat a fly. But I don't know, it was just interesting that you actually called it a signal, which was kind of where the character's name comes from. And yeah, that's spot on is what you thought. And I did notice it in your preview, and it was great because it's a very nice moment, and we love when people see that and then they get it right away, which has been happening, which is awesome.
Yeah, I felt really bad that I said it out loud. I was like, oh man, that totally probably, for somebody who hasn't seen the game, that probably spoiled it for them. And I was like, oh, I wish that I hadn't recorded that, because it was such a cool moment. And I thought about editing it out, but I also thought at the same time, like, for somebody who hadn't seen it, like that might draw them into the game, because I just thought that was such a clever narrative for this game. Because at first, when I first saw the really oddball art, I was like, what is going on here? This is so bananas. What is happening? And then when it all came together at the end of the tutorial, I just wanted to high five you guys, because I was like, I was so impressed. I thought that was awesome.
Love it. That's so sweet. We can high five right now. And
there you go.
But it's great. Thanks for saying that. And it's funny because it's such like a simple thing, and it's actually something that I feel the moment that Jess had the idea, it was like one of those things that I always think that people that write like awesome movies or books or things, when they get like that really brilliant idea and then they make this like awesome story out of it, except it was like this tiny moment in time that was kind of really mediocre and monotonous. Like in a way I was like, oh, it's even better. I love it. It's just like such a a thing that we've all done when we see a fly, or there's some fly bothering us. But yeah, it's great.
All right, so we're about to wrap this up. I've got a couple more questions for you. First off, what is the hardest part of your job?
Man, what is the hardest part of my job? In relation to Membrane, or just in game design in general?
Up to you.
Up to me. All right. That's a good question. I'm gonna say, maybe it kind of answers both questions in this, and or both in Membrane and just in general. But I think that creating a game or some kind of interactive piece of media when somebody can play it or pick it up for the first time, and there's this kind of perfect split of them understanding it and being comfortable with what they're doing, and also that other side where they're excited and kind of confused and excited about the possibilities, and they don't necessarily know what's happening. And I think, especially with games or interactive art, there's that perfect balance where you don't want somebody to just like pick it up and like be able to just blow through it and know exactly what's happening, because that's not really fun. And there needs to be this, I guess it's kind of difficulty in a way, but I like to think of it more as this balance where you want players to be in a little bit of a unknown territory where they feel not scared or anything like that, but it's like exciting, when you kind of you don't necessarily know what's going to happen, and you're assuming that the designer is going to guide you along and not just throw you into a pit that has no light and no guidance. And that's like a really delicate thing in game design, especially because, with a movie, it's going to happen for 2 hours, no matter what, or an album or something. You put it on and you may be a little confused by it, but it's just going to play through. Where a game, like, somebody has to actually do it and get through it. And so there's this really delicate balance between, guiding the player, but also letting them explore and figure things out on their own. And it's just really hard to perfect, and something that I think nobody, even the best game designers in the world, still struggle with, even though they're making stuff that is really well done. But it ultimately takes, takes a lot of playtesting, a ton of just getting your game in people's hands all the time. And that in itself is scary, because you want to make sure it's perfect and what it is in your mind before you let people play it. And, I think it's the beauty of games too, is this interactive element where you give your art to somebody else and let them make what they want out of it and figure out what to do with it. But, it doesn't always work. And, definitely with Membrane, we made some design decisions to not overly tell you what to do or overly kind of guide you down, this is the one thing to do. But there's moments when, people, even with the narrative, like yourself, I remember when you were like, oh, wait, is this? And you like got it and you figured it out, even though there was kind of this uncertainty in a way, or when players figure out certain ways to use the control or like the bricks in the game in building a ladder for themselves or building this or that. And they you can hear them kind of be like, aha, like a little light bulb goes on in their head, which is super satisfying for them. And it wouldn't happen if I just like told them you can do all these things specifically. And so it's like a weird balance, and it's something that's really scary and very hard to perfect, and something is still working on. But
you know what? That answer right there, that tells me that you are an educator. Because I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm a science teacher, and there's a guy who is. Have you ever heard of Bozeman Science?
Bozeman Science. I don't know if I have.
He's huge on YouTube. His name's Paul Anderson, and he has this whole thing about never kill the wonder by telling the student what it is that they're supposed to learn. And you just totally summed up that exact same thing with game design. You don't want to kill the players' interest in your game by handing it to them. And I think that's a great answer. And I think that's an answer that probably only a teacher would come up with.
Nice.
So I really appreciate that.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
I guess the last thing that I have a question for you is, what is something that you do for fun that has absolutely nothing to do with video games?
Great question. I guess seems boring, I guess, but I like to play music is something I love to do. Been in a handful of bands. My wife Jess and I have a band together. We haven't played as much as we did a couple years ago because of the membrane, but love to play music. I also, I guess exercising and sports doesn't count because it's kind of a game. But I'll go with music and cooking. I love to cook too.
Awesome. And the follow-up is, have you ever thought about making a game about that?
Oh, all right. I've made a handful, like a couple little experiments of like musical games that are more like interactive music tools, because I really like weird audio experimentation stuff. But cooking is something I've definitely like been thinking about of, games, because there's so many cooking specific games out there. And then there's games like that have cooking in them. It's like a side quest thing or something outside of the main interaction of the game. But yeah, I mean, food is just so weird and cool, and like there's so many different ways to approach it. And I think I'd love to make some kind of game about food and cooking that was different. I don't know. Someday.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, Seth. I really appreciate it. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find your stuff?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And you can find Membrane on the Nintendo eShop right now for $10, $9.99. It's available the Switch isn't region locked, but it's available right now in North America or with a North American account. And then right now we're actually currently getting it through certification, so it'll be out in Australia and Europe by the end of this month. And you can find us on Twitter at Membrane Game, also online. And that's where you can find us.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on, and keep up the good work.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.